Good afternoon, class. Welcome back. I'm going to take a few minutes here to finish up some comments that I didn't get to today in class. And we are starting off this week, week 2, where we're looking at the experience of pre-European peoples. We could call them Amerindians or Native Americans. We're looking at their experience as the first inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere. And this will help us sort of set the stage as we will proceed during this week. We'll be looking at the experience of Pueblo societies, which is a sort of a characteristic of tribes in the American Southwest. And then we'll go to the Mi'kmaq in the Northeast, and then we'll close out the week talking about Plains Indian peoples. And all of this is aimed at helping us understand a little bit of how pre-European societies established their most fundamental relationship with their natural environment. And so we will have a number of different opportunities to apply the thoughts of Donald Worster and Jared Diamond and Bill Cronin and Carolyn Merchant as we proceed through the week. But we left off today talking about a really important event, an event that sort of gathered a lot of attention or garnered a lot of attention among environmental historians, but also among anthropologists and archaeologists. And this is the earliest events of the arrival of the first inhabitants of the Americas. And in particular, we're looking at the Pleistocene extinctions. So roughly 14 to 15,000 years ago, when the first immigrants to the Western Hemisphere arrived, we know that some important changes began to take place within the natural environment of the Western Hemisphere. And the question is, where did this widespread, and it's fairly well documented, but these widespread extinctions, which have come to be known as the Pleistocene extinctions, where did they come from? What caused them? And so we have here evidence of all sorts of mammals, not just megafauna. There were countless mammals that, things like salamanders and squirrels are sort of everyday species, certain types of them that went extinct during this time. But of course, the more dramatic examples are these very large predators, some of which have incredible scope. Like, for example, there were beavers that weighed over 300 pounds and bears that weighed in excess of 1,500 pounds. These are mammals that existed in far greater, the size of them was far greater than anything that we experience today. And in a short period of time, they just disappeared. So one of the most common theories that's been used to explain these Pleistocene extinctions is known as the Blitzkrieg theory. And this was put forward by a gentleman by the name of Calvin Martin, who came along in the late 20th century, and he, through a model that he put together with some fellow academics, postulated that the Pleistocene extinctions, and this is his thinking, or his words, were caused by man and man alone. And so the idea behind this Blitzkrieg theory, and those of you who know your World War II history know that Blitzkrieg was a form of warfare used by Adolf Hitler in the early years of World War II, and it was intended to essentially overwhelm the enemy with essentially, it was the predecessor to shock and awe as a military strategy, that you bring such a fierce amount of offense upon your opponent that in a very short period of time they are demoralized and feel overwhelmed and will surrender. So Martin presumably was using this important imagery as a way of explaining the way the Paleo-Indians first descended upon the unsuspecting mammals of the Western Hemisphere shortly after their arrival 15,000 years ago. And central to his theory is the idea we have here, the assumptions of this Blitzkrieg theory, which had the Paleo-Indians as super predators, meaning they were able to despoil and destroy their animals that they fed upon for their livelihood. This was their mode of production as hyper hunters, you could say. Pardon me. And so the idea was that if a group of 100 immigrants, let's say that was the first group to cross over Beringia and begin their descent farther south, that if this took place 12,000 years ago, you could assume that they would be moving about 20 miles per year, the assumption being that it would take them essentially that they would need to extend 20 miles to pursue and successfully meet their needs for survival. Essentially, the range of the animals that would be necessary to sustain them would require them to venture 20 more miles each year. And further, the assumption was that each individual would need 12 animals a year to sustain him or herself. Further assumption was that every 20 years this population would double. Well, if you put all these figures into your calculator and you crunch them, you have over 300 years, you'll have 100,000 immigrants. They will travel a total of 2,000 miles, so they'll probably make it almost to the border of the United States in just 300 years. And they will, over the course of that time, together kill 90 million animals. So this is kind of, it's a theory, and Martin put this together, and of course one of his supporting arguments is that these animals, having never coexisted or co-evolved next to humans, would have been uniquely vulnerable. It would explain why they wouldn't necessarily have a healthy built-in fear for humans, and that this could help explain the relatively easy time that the Paleo-Indians had in conquering. So I put this forward just to help us understand a little bit of some of the ways in which environmental historians think about this. Now, Martin's theory has not been fully accepted, and as you can tell, there are quite a few assumptions built into it that aren't necessarily true. One of the real problems with it is that we don't have that many archaeological sites that attest to, a human killing of animals. Now, there are some. We've found things like, sites where there are ruins of horses or bison or beavers where there is evidence of human-caused, scraping of the skeletal and bone structure. Or as you can see here in this picture, we have a this is kind of like a Clovis head. It's a spear or a cutting stone. Actually, this looks like obsidian to me. That is used as a device for scraping flesh from a animal skeleton. Now, that of course helps convince us there must be a human present that would use a human tool to create and meet a human need. So that's a pretty compelling evidence. The problem is there aren't too many of these sites that have been found. So Martin's theory does require a little bit of, you have to use your imagination to fill in the blanks a little bit. Also, we do know a little bit about the technology that these Paleo-Indians would have used. This is something a little bit separate now from the Blitzkrieg theory. But the Clovis head is, this is essentially a spear, a spearhead that is used as sort of a tool by early Paleo-Indians people. We call them the Clovis people because it's not long after the arrival of the Paleo-Indians into the Western Hemisphere that we start to discover these sorts of artifacts and tools that are evident. Also, the atlatl, I have a picture here of someone using this spear, and you can see this piece here is used as a launching tool, and there's a little notch on the end, so when it's put back, as you can see in this picture, and it's resting on the hunter's shoulder, there's that little tool with the notch that sits in the back of the spear or arrow shaft, and then when it's flung in this way, it launches with considerable distance and force, significant velocity, and can be a very effective hunting tool. So atlatls were one of the tools that Paleo-Indian people used to help increase their the success of their hunt. Pardon me? Now, one of the things that critics of Martin's theory also point out is that, you know, hunting isn't the only way that these people would have sustained themselves. So because these people would have been hunters and gatherers, they also would have, for one, not just focused on megafauna, but they would have diversified their subsistence. In some ways you could say they would have diversified their modes of production by also including alternatives to the hunted game. And so if this is true, then this is going to affect some of the assumptions that Martin puts into his thesis. And then other evidence that critics of Martin's thesis will put forward is that there are other animals that went extinct over the course of these Pleistocene extinctions, and many of these do not have the characteristics of being, you know, hunted. These aren't your typical wild game that Paleo-Indian people would have sought out and desired. So the question then, of course, is there something else going on? And so to bring that full circle, the folks who are not in the Calvin-Martin camp tend to be in the climate camp, suggesting that the Pleistocene extinctions probably were probably caused, you know, perhaps humans did take and had a negative consequence for animal populations shortly after the arrival of these people across the land bridge of Beringia, but that it was first and foremost probably climate change that altered and harmed so many of these mammals. And so they point to, you know, for example, as you can see here in this little explanation, this doesn't explain obviously the Pleistocene extinctions, but it's used as an example that we know that 55 million years ago, this is based on measuring methane samples within core samples of the Arctic ice capsules, that there was a huge release of methane 55 million years ago that was the result also of widespread extinctions. So just the idea being that if this happened 55 million years ago, these types of episodes have probably also happened at other times during history. And so people call attention to you know, temperature spikes that would have, you know, happened. We believe that shortly after the thawing of the polar ice caps, there would have been higher summer temperatures and colder winter temperatures. So simply the swing in annual temperature cycles would have been greater. This would have had consequences for certain types of vegetation, plants, insects, which would have affected the diet and the ability of many mammals to fend for themselves. So if this is in fact the case, and again, it's speculation, but it's speculation that can be used to at least discredit or cast further doubt upon Martin's thesis. So I'll leave you with this, with these questions to think about. We know from the Pleistocene era experience that unlike maybe what we're tempted to think about in the environmental or even the tribal histories, people have always had a consequence or always have had impact upon their natural environment. And so as we look at these experiences and the theories surrounding the Pleistocene extinctions, it begs a whole host of questions. And some of these are things we'll be wrestling with as we go through the quarter together. So thanks for listening and have a great afternoon. Bye.